At 08:41 a.m., November 12, 1944, a single 12,000-pound tallboy Barnes Wallace's supersonic fin-stabilized earthquake bomb punches through the unsinkable Tirpitz like a needle through armor plate. The impact sounds like a cathedral bell struck by lightning. For 2 years, the beast had humiliated every Allied attempt surviving midget subs, dive bombers, and 33 failed raids that cost hundreds of lives and millions in fuel. Churchill lost sleep over it. Admirals aged trying to kill it. Crews died trying to reach it. Yet in 90 seconds, everything changes. The paradox. How did this one mission succeed where 33 failed? And why did the outcome hinge entirely on one RAF navigator drawing an impossible route across the Arctic sky, a pencil line that violated neutral airspace, pushed fuel limits to the edge of catastrophe, and required stripping bombers so bare that crews wore plimsolls to avoid sparking explosions? This is the story of the raid that should have been suicide and became legend. Tirpitz was not just a battleship. It was a 42 900-ton iron nightmare that paralyzed the entire North Atlantic. 8 15-inch guns. Each shell weighed a ton. 320-millimeter belt armor thicker than a bank vault. Faster than any British battleship afloat. Capable of obliterating convoys 17 miles beyond the horizon before they even knew death was coming. Churchill called it the Beast. He wasn't exaggerating. In July 1942, convoy PQ-17 was steaming toward the Soviet Union 35 merchant ships carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition. Then came the message Tirpitz is sortying. The Admiralty panicked, ordered the convoy to scatter. Destroyers fled. Merchant ships were left defenseless. U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers slaughtered them like sheep. 24 ships sunk, 153 sailors dead, 430 tanks lost. 210 aircraft destroyed, 3,350 vehicles gone to the bottom. Tirpitz never fired a shot. It didn't have to. Fear was weapon enough. For 2 years, the beast sat in Norwegian fjords, a loaded gun pointed at every convoy, trying to keep the Soviet Union alive. Stalin demanded action. Churchill obsessed over it. The Admiralty threw everything they had at it. And failed. Again. And again. By November 1944, fuel shortages and battle damage had chained Tirpitz to Hokoya Island, Tromsø Fjord, deep inside the Arctic Circle. It could no longer hunt. But anchored there, protected by black basalt cliffs, rising like fortress walls, it remained a deadly coastal fortress. A symbol, a taunt. And finally, just barely within theoretical Lancaster range from Scotland. Theoretical. That word carried the weight of gravestones. It meant stripped aircraft, auxiliary fuel tanks packed with volatile gasoline, navigational precision measured in minutes and miles. It meant one mistake, 1 degree off course, and the entire formation would go down in the Arctic. No rescue, no survivors, just cold black water and silence. But Tromsø wasn't just distant. It was defended like a fortress. Smoke generators could blanket the entire anchorage in white haze, within 4 minutes turning precision bombing into blind guesswork. Würzburg and Freya radar arrays tracked every approach from 100 miles out, painting formations on screens with terrifying accuracy. And at Bardufoss Airfield, 90 miles south, Jagdgeschwader 5. The IceMere wing, the Icy Aces, kept Bf-109s and FW-190s on constant alert. Pilots who'd survived the Eastern Front. Men who knew every valley, every cloud layer, every trick the Arctic sky could play. German radar and JG-5 IceMere Aces guarded those fjords like Arctic wolves circling wounded prey. Tirpitz had become more than a ship. It was proof that some targets were untouchable, that even the full weight of Allied air power had limits, that sometimes the enemy simply could not be beaten. One final chance remained, a razor-thin window, a route no one had dared to fly, and a navigator willing to stake 29 crews' lives on a pencil line drawn across a map. He was 23 years old, An electrical engineering student before the war, the kind of young man more comfortable with slide rules than rifles, with star tables than battle orders. Now he sat in the nose of a Lancaster bomber under dim red cockpit light that turned everything the color of blood. Frost crept across the Perspex canopy like frozen fingers. The constant thrum of 4 Merlin engines, one on 600 horsepower each, vibrated through his chartboard, through his bones, through every pencil line he drew. He was a navigator with RAF No. 6117 Squadron, the Dam Busters, alongside crews from No. 9 Squadron. These weren't ordinary bomber units, they were precision specialists. The men called in when targets mattered, when failure wasn't just costly, it was catastrophic. His tools were almost absurdly simple for what they asked of him: a sextant for reading stars through a dome overhead, a stopwatch, a pencil worn down to a stub, a slide rule, star tables printed on thin paper that crinkled in his frozen fingers, and a chart clipped to a board that never stopped shaking. His responsibility was absolute. If he miscalculated by 1 degree, just one, the formation would miss Tromsø entirely. Or worse, run out of fuel over the Barents Sea. There would be no rescue. The water was 2 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia killed in minutes. The Arctic didn't leave bodies. It swallowed them. 29 crews, 203 men, all following a route he would draw. In his logbook beside the mission brief, he had written 7 words in careful, precise script: "If I am wrong, we all die." His crew never questioned him. The pilot, a farmer's son from Yorkshire, followed his headings without hesitation. The bomb aimer, a school teacher before the war, relied on his timing to the second. The gunner's boys, really barely old enough to shave, trusted that if flak found them, it wouldn't be because someone made a mistake. It would be because the mission demanded it. They trusted him completely, and that trust was a weight heavier than any bomb. He kept a photograph clipped beside the altimeter. A woman and a child, his wife, his daughter. No names written. He didn't need names. Just a reminder of what waited if he got the math right, what he'd never see again if he got it wrong. Navigation in 1944 wasn't automated. There were no GPS satellites, no computers, no safety net. It was celestial fixes taken through a sextant dome while the aircraft bucked through turbulence. Dead reckoning over featureless black ocean where one whitecap looked exactly like another. Constant adjustment for wind drift that could push the formation miles off course. Fuel burn calculations that changed every time the pilot adjusted throttle. Weight shifts as bombs sat heavy in the bay, and in the Arctic it required something more. An ability to read the sky when stars disappeared behind clouds, to sense when instruments were lying, to make decisions in the dark when everything reason, instinct, math disagreed. This navigator had that ability, quiet, methodical, unshakable even when his hands trembled from cold. He was the kind of man who double-checked his work not because he doubted himself, but because 203 other men were counting on him to be right. Because mistakes at 15,000 feet over the Arctic Circle didn't get second chances. Because his daughter deserved to know her father came home. He would draw a route no one believed was possible. A pencil line across neutral airspace. A corridor threading between German radar stations by margins measured in miles. A path that violated international law, pushed fuel limits to catastrophic extremes, and required precision so absolute that 3 minutes, just 3 minutes, would separate survival from annihilation. And 29 Lancasters would follow that line into history. Because when the world asks the impossible, it doesn't ask loudly. It asks quietly, with a pencil, and a chart, and a man willing to write 7 words in a logbook and mean them. 2 years, 33 attempts, hundreds of lives, millions in fuel and ordnance. And Tirpitz still floated. April 1944. Fleet Air Arm. Barracuda dive bombers, 40 aircraft screamed down through flak that turned the sky black. Bombs struck the armored deck with thunderous cracks that echoed across the fjord, then bounced, like stones skipping off a roof. 320 millimeter Krupp steel laughed at them, Smoke generators fired within minutes, choking the fjord in white haze, so thick bomb aimers couldn't see their own wingtips. They dropped blind. Splashes, near misses, nothing more. 3 aircraft didn't come home. August they tried again. Same result: smoke, confusion, wasted ordnance, more empty chairs in the ready room. September 1943, Operation Source, the bravest attempt yet. British X-craft midget submarines, tiny claustrophobic tubes of riveted steel, penetrated Kofjord's defenses. 4 men per sub breathing recycled air, navigating blind through anti-torpedo nets that could crush them like beer cans. They planted limpet mines beneath Tirpitz's hull. Explosions shook the ship. Turbines cracked. Germans scrambled. But the nets had mangled 2 of the subs. Crews were captured, tortured for information, and Tirpitz battered, yes, but afloat went into repairs. Months of work. But it survived. Again. Then came the Tall Boys. Barnes-Wallis's masterpiece, 12,000 pounds of streamlined, explosive, supersonic, fin-stabilized, designed to punch through anything and detonate deep like an earthquake. Precision weapons for an age that desperately needed them. September 15th, 1944. 27 Lancasters flew from Yagodnik, Soviet Union. They carried Tall Boys. This was supposed to be the raid that ended it, but smoke generators fired again. White fog swallowed the fjord within 3 minutes. The Tall Boys fell, 1 hit, just 1. It damaged Tirpitz, but the ship stayed afloat. The beast endured. October heavy Arctic cloud rolled in solid overcast at 10,000 feet. No visibility. The formation turned back without dropping. Fuel wasted. Hours wasted. Hope wasted. Each failure fed German confidence like kindling on a fire. Tirpitz seemed eternal, invincible. German sailors called it unsinkable, and they were starting to believe it. The Luftwaffe knew it too. At Bardufoss Airfield, 90 miles south, Jagdgeschwader 5 kept fighters on constant alert. Bf-109, G6s, and FW-190A8s flown by aces who'd survived the Eastern Front. These weren't rookies. They were wolves, and they didn't need long to intercept. Just warning, just time. Würzburg and Freya radar arrays painted every formation 100 miles out. German controllers tracked approach angles, altitudes, headings. They knew when the British were coming before the British crossed the Norwegian coast. The fighters would be airborne and waiting, and the fjord itself was the ultimate weapon. Steep basalt cliffs funneled bombers into predictable approach paths. Flag batteries knew exactly where to aim, 15,200 feet. That's where the Lancasters had to fly to drop Tall Boys accurately. And that's exactly where the flak would be waiting. 33 attempts. 33 times the Allies threw men and machines in desperation at Tirpitz. 33 times they failed. The ship had become more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological victory for Germany. Proof that the Reich could still defy the Allies. That some symbols were untouchable. But in late October 1944, reconnaissance photos showed something. Tirpitz had moved. Repositioned from Kofjord to Tromsø, slightly farther north, but critically, just barely within maximum Lancaster range from Scotland. Barely. The margin was a knife edge. Fuel calculations were catastrophic. The route was theoretical. Success required perfection. Except for one navigator who believed math didn't lie, who believed precision could beat armor, who believed that the impossible was only impossible until someone proved otherwise. One final chance. One pencil line. One route no one had dared to fly. The briefing room at RAF Lossiemouth was cold enough to see your breath. Officers stood around a table covered in charts, radar plots, and fuel calculations scrawled in chalk. The navigator stepped forward, placed a pencil on the map, and drew a line. It cut across the Norwegian Sea, threaded through a narrow corridor over northern Sweden, neutral Sweden, and curved into Tromsø from the east. A direction the Germans would never expect. The room went silent. "That's neutral airspace," an officer said flatly. It's also outside German radar coverage for most of the approach, the navigator replied. His voice was calm, too calm. If we stay low over Sweden, we avoid Würzburg and Freya detection until we're almost on top of them. They won't see us coming until it's too late. What about fuel? The navigator tapped the blackboard. Maximum Lancaster range 250 miles. Required distance 400 miles round trip. The gap was a death sentence written in mathematics. We strip everything, he said. Mid-upper turrets gone, armor plate dumped, ammunition slashed. We install 200-gallon Wellington auxiliary tanks and 50-gallon Mosquito tanks in the fuselage. Layered, volatile. We fly on fumes and prayer. Someone laughed, nervous, bitter. You're asking us to turn Lancasters into flying petrol bombs. I'm asking you to win, the navigator said quietly. 33 attempts failed because we've been predictable. This route they won't expect. It's the only advantage we'll have. And if Sweden protests, then we apologize after we sink Tirpitz. The engineering officer spoke up. Those auxiliary tanks, one spark static electricity, a stray tracer, even friction from a metal buckle, and the whole aircraft goes up like a Roman candle. A crews wear plimsolls, the navigator said. No boots, no metal on metal, no sparks. Plimsolls, gym shoes, on a bombing raid into the Arctic Circle. Yes. The group captain, grizzled 50 years old, stared at the map, at the pencil line threading between Swedish mountains and German radar arcs by margins measured in single-digit miles. If this works, he said slowly, it's the most precise navigation in RAF history. And if it doesn't, the navigator didn't blink. Then 29 Lancasters disappear over the Arctic and Tirpitz wins. The group captain nodded once. Begin modifications, 48 hours. Ground crews worked through the night. Under floodlights, they unbolted mid-upper turrets' perspex domes that had saved gunners' lives in 100 dogfights. Gone. Dumped beside runways like discarded armor. They pried up armor plate from cockpit floors and fuselage walls. Plates designed to stop machine gun rounds and shrapnel. Gone. Ammunition was slashed. If German fighters caught them, the Lancasters would barely be able to fight back. Then came the fuel tanks. Auxiliary tanks, 200-gallon Wellington tanks. 50-gallon Mosquito tanks were wrestled into fuselages through access hatches never designed for this. Strapped, bracketed, jury-rigged. The fuel sloshed. The weight distribution shifted. Aircraft that had once flown balanced now sat nose-heavy, tail-light, asymmetrical. Pilots would have to compensate manually for 6 hours over open ocean with no room for error. And the fumes. High-octane aviation gasoline evaporating in closed fuselages waiting for ignition. One spark and the crew wouldn't burn, they'd vaporize. So the crews were issued plimsolls, canvas gym shoes with rubber soles. No metal eyelets, no hobnails. Men who'd trained in heavy flight boots would now fly in footwear meant for schoolyard games. The navigator watched the modifications. He checked fuel calculations again and again. He ran star table projections for wind drift over Sweden. He plotted alternate routes, though alternate route was a polite fiction. There were no alternates, just the line he'd drawn or death. On November 11, 32, Lancasters taxied onto frozen runways. Engines roared, 4 Merlins per aircraft, 6 400 horsepower of thunder. The airframes groaned under weight they were never designed to carry. 3 aircraft aborted before leaving Scottish airspace. Mechanical failures, fuel leaks, 29 pressed on. They followed the navigator's route. A pencil line on a map, a razor-thin corridor threading between German radar stations by miles so narrow that 1 degree of drift would put them in detection range. It violated international law. It risked explosion. It pushed every margin to the edge of physics. But it was the only way. And 29 Lancasters stripped vulnerable flying on fumes, and desperation followed that line north into the Arctic night. Because sometimes the only path to victory is the one no sane person would ever take. Before dawn on November 12, 32, Lancasters lifted off from frozen Scottish runways. Engines screamed, airframes groaned under impossible weight. Ice cracked beneath the wheels. 3 aircraft aborted within the first hour. Fuel leaks, engine failures. 29 pressed on toward Norway. They flew low over the North Sea, too low for German radar to track reliably. Then came the Norwegian coast, jagged black basalt dusted with snow. The Lancasters climbed to 15,200 feet and turned east. The navigator checked his watch. On time, exactly. But at Bardufoss, German radar operators had already seen them. Würzburg and Freya arrays had painted the formation hours earlier. The alert went out. Scramble order immediate. Luftwaffe pilots sprinted across frozen tarmac. BF-109s and FW-190s coughed to life with blue exhaust smoke. Canopies slammed shut, throttles forward. Then confusion. A Junkers Ju-52 transport carrying wounded from the Eastern Front radioed for landing clearance. Priority traffic. Controllers hesitated. The fighters were waved off. The Ju-52 touchdown rolled to a stop. Finally, the fighters received clearance. 3 minutes lost, documented in Luftwaffe logs. 3 minutes that would decide everything. Meanwhile, the Lancasters approached Tromsø from the east, the unguarded flank. The fjord opened below like a frozen knife wound. Frost glittered on black water, and there anchored against the shore was Tirpitz. Flak erupted immediately. 88mm shells burst at 15,200 feet, black puffs close enough to kill. Then came 15-inch naval shells from Tirpitz itself, rising like molten meteors, slow and terrifying. The formation held steady. Bomb bay doors opened. Tall boys fell, 12,000 pounds each. Fins stabilized, spinning, supersonic. They fell for 19 seconds. Wind whistled through the tail fins, a fading Doppler note, eerie and final. Smoke generators fired on the ground. Too late. The tall boys were already falling. At 08:41 a.m., the first tall boy struck Tirpitz amidships above the boiler rooms. It punched through the armored deck, detonated deep inside. The explosion ripped through compartments, vaporized steel. A fireball erupted through the superstructure. Metal screamed. Seconds later, a second tall boy hit near turret Bruno. The 1,000-ton turret lifted off its mount, hung in the air, then crashed into the sea with a 50-foot splash. 3 near misses detonated underwater. Shockwaves bent the keel, cracked the spine, split seams. Water poured in. A flood. Inside chaos. Lights failed. Hatches jammed. Sailors scrambled in darkness. Water rose cold, black, merciless. Some sang Deutschland lied, voices fading. Others clawed at steel, trying to reach air. On deck, men leapt into the fjord. The water was 2 degrees Celsius. Oil coated the surface. Hypothermia took minutes. Tirpitz listed 10 degrees, 30, 50, 70. At 09:50 a.m., 69 minutes after the first bomb, Tirpitz capsized completely. The hull rolled, exposing red anti-fouling paint streaked with oil. It settled with a sound like a cathedral collapsing. 971 men died, some instantly. Others slowly trapped in shrinking air pockets as rescuers cut through steel with torches. Above, the Lancasters turned west. All 29, not one lost. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. Pilots nursed throttles. The navigator recalculated headings. They flew in silence, no celebration, just Merlin engines and the knowledge they'd done something impossible. At Bardufoss, the fighters finally reached altitude. They scanned the horizon. Empty sky. The bombers were gone. 3 minutes. 3 minutes lost to a Ju-52 landing clearance. 3 minutes that saved 29 British crews and doomed a battleship. The German pilots circled once, then descended. Nothing left to defend. Below Tirpitz lay belly up. Smoke rose. Oil spread. Rescuers worked frantically, some alive, most not. The beast was dead. The Arctic convoys were finally free. 2 direct hits, one amidships above boiler rooms, one near turret Bruno blowing the 1,000-ton turret free like a child's toy. 3 near misses created underwater shockwaves that bent the ship's spine like breaking bone. In 90 seconds, the geometry of destruction was complete. Tirpitz listed 30 degrees, then 70, then rolled completely, exposing her red-painted belly to the Arctic sky like a dying animal showing its throat. Inside, 971 German sailors fought for their lives in darkness. Water rose through shattered compartments. Some sang Deutschland lied until their voices drowned. Others hammered on jammed hatches with bare fists until the water reached their chins. Rescuers arrived within minutes. Norwegian civilians and German soldiers cutting openings with welding torches, orange sparks showering onto oil-slicked water. The tide was rising, air pockets shrinking. They pulled men through holes barely wide enough for shoulders, some gasping delirious. Most already gone. 87 survived. The rest remained entombed. Above all, 29 Lancasters survived one of the luckiest escapes in RAF history. Some crews landed with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining, but every aircraft came home. Every man stepped onto Scottish soil alive. The fighters from Bardufoss arrived only 3 minutes too late, close enough to see contrails, but not close enough to fire a shot. 3 minutes. The difference between survival and annihilation. Within hours, British intelligence confirmed the kill. Churchill received the cable. He read it twice. Then wrote just 2 words: "At last." The impact rippled across the war. The Arctic convoy's lifeline to the Soviet Union no longer needed battleship escorts. Destroyers could focus entirely on U-boats. Shipping losses dropped immediately. Supplies flowed faster, tanks, aircraft, ammunition pouring into Murmansk without delay. Stalin sent a terse message of congratulation. For the Kriegsmarine, Tirpitz's loss was catastrophic. Scharnhorst was gone. Gneisenau was gone. Now Tirpitz. The German Navy's surface fleet was effectively finished. What remained were U-boats in desperation. Morale shattered. Sailors who survived were reassigned to submarines, to shore batteries, to infantry units facing the collapsing Eastern Front. Some refused orders. The spirit that had once made the Kriegsmarine formidable was broken alongside the ship's keel. German propaganda tried to spin it. They claimed it had taken dozens of bombers and hundreds of bombs. The truth that 29 Lancasters had done it in 90 seconds with precision strikes was too humiliating to admit. In Tromsø, locals watched in silence. The fjord reeked of oil and cordite. Bodies floated for days. Norwegian fishermen pulled them from the water buoys, barely old enough to shave. They buried them quietly in a military cemetery. Simple wooden crosses. No names at first, just numbers painted in white. For RAF No. 6117 Squadron, the mission became instant legend. But there was no parade. The crews returned to Lossiemouth refueled, debriefed, and prepared for the next mission. That was the job. The navigator filed his report, 7 pages of coordinates, timings, fuel consumption. Dry, technical. He never mentioned the pencil line that changed everything. To him, it was just mathematics. But in the operations room, officers studied that route for hours. The corridor over Sweden, the radar gaps, the fuel margins calculated to the minute. It was brilliance disguised as routine. Years later, historians would call the Tirpitz raid one of the most precise long-range bombing operations of World War II. A textbook example of planning, execution, and calculated risk. But in November 1944, it was just another mission. Another target crossed off. Tirpitz was dead. The last major German surface threat to the Arctic convoys was eliminated. The beast that had paralyzed Allied strategy for 2 years lay capsized in a frozen fjord. And the war ground on. 971 sailors died inside Tirpitz. Most never saw the bombs coming. They were below decks, engine rooms, ammunition stores, crew quarters when the tall boys punched through steel and detonated in confined spaces. Some died instantly crushed, incinerated. Others drowned as compartments flooded in total darkness. water rising while emergency klaxons wailed until the electrical system shorted out and left only silence. A few survived in air pockets trapped as the hull rolled. They could hear rescuers above, welding torches cutting through steel, voices shouting, hammers tapping trying to locate survivors. The trapped men tapped back. Desperate rhythms. Morse code, spelling names, compartment numbers, anything to guide the rescuers faster. But the tide was rising. The air pockets were shrinking, and steel is slow to cut. Some men sang as they waited. Deutschland lied. Lily Marlene. Songs that meant home. Their voices grew quieter as the water climbed first to their waists, then their chests, then their chins. Then nothing. Rescuers worked for 3 days. Norwegian civilians alongside German soldiers' enemies, united by the desperate arithmetic of life and death. They pulled 87 men from the wreckage. The rest, 884 men, remained entombed. Norwegian fishermen buried the recovered bodies in a military cemetery near Tromsø. Simple crosses. For weeks, no names, just numbers painted in white. Later, when German records arrived, families came. Mothers, wives, children who barely remembered their fathers. Some left flowers that froze overnight. Most just stood in silence, staring at crosses that offered no answers. For the RAF crews, survival felt almost obscene. All 32 Lancasters returned intact. The odds had been impossible, yet they'd threaded the needle perfectly and come home. In the debriefing room at Lossiemouth, crews sat in silence. No celebration. Just the weight of what they'd done. They'd killed 971 men in 90 seconds. Precision bombing. Clinical. Necessary. But still, 971 men. Some went to the pub that night. Quiet toasts with trembling hands. Others wrote letters home, struggling to find words that didn't sound hollow. The navigator returned to his quarters and updated his logbook. Mission successful. All aircraft returned. Target destroyed. 7 lines of data. He closed the book, looked at the photograph of his wife and daughter, and allowed himself one quiet breath of relief. He'd gotten the math right. Everyone came home, but 971 others hadn't. Post-war bureaucracy buried the uncomfortable truths. Reports of the route over neutral Sweden were quietly classified. Acknowledging the overflight would create diplomatic complications, so the navigator's impossible corridor faded into footnotes marked restricted. The Luftwaffe logs documenting the 3-minute delay at Bardufoss, the Ju-52 landing, the scramble confusion were filed away in archives that wouldn't be open for decades. When historians finally found them in the 1980s, the pieces fell into place. The raid hadn't succeeded purely through British brilliance. It had succeeded because the Germans had hesitated at exactly the wrong moment. The navigator never talked much about the mission. When asked, he'd shrug. "We did the job, that's all." He didn't mention the sleepless nights calculating fuel margins, didn't mention the 7 words in his logbook, didn't mention the weight of knowing 203 men trusted him to be right. In 1995, 51 years after the raid, a memorial was unveiled at Tromsø. British and German veterans attended. Old men, now grandfathers who'd lived full lives after the war, tried to kill them. They shook hands. Some cried, not from grief exactly, from recognition, that they'd all been young once, that they'd all believed in something worth dying for, that history had made them enemies, but time had made them survivors. The navigator was there standing quietly at the back. Someone asked if he'd drawn the route everyone still talked about. He nodded. "How did you know it would work?" He paused. "I didn't. I just knew it was the only chance we had." 5 seconds of silence. Total black. No narration, no music, just wind over a frozen fjord. Then faintly the echo of a song. Deutschland Lied. Fading like memory itself. Still water-coated in oil. Rusted steel under snow. Aged hands clasping across a table. The war had ended 50 years ago, but its ghost still sang in the dark. Decades later, former enemies met as old men, RAF navigator, and German ace sharing drinks, not gunfire. The German had been one of the Bardufoss pilots that morning, scrambling, racing to intercept bombers he never caught. For 50 years, he'd wondered what 3 minutes felt like from the other side. The navigator told him, "Like holding your breath for 6 hours." They laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that carries weight. "Did you ever regret it?" the German asked. The navigator shook his head slowly. "We didn't sink a ship to destroy it. We sank it to end the war, so men like you and me could sit here instead of killing each other." The German raised his glass. No toast, just silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. The Tirpitz raid became a symbol not of destruction, but of precision, courage, and humanity's fragile triumph over machines. A pencil line on a map sank a battleship, but the men who drew it and the men who tried to stop it built something far greater peace. In the end, Tirpitz did not die in glory. It died in silence in a lonely Arctic fjord, undone not by brute force, but by the geometry of one man's mind. Today, Tirpitz rests beneath Tromsø Fjord. Divers visit the wreck. Rust coats the steel. Fish swim through shattered compartments where men once sang and died. The ship has become part of the landscape, a monument not to power, but to fragility. Snowfall drifts over the memorial. Soft waves brush rusted hull fragments. The crosses in the cemetery stand silent under auroral light. German boys and Norwegian fishermen resting in the same frozen ground, no longer enemies, just graves. The navigator never became famous. His name appears in mission logs, but not in headlines. He didn't want headlines. He wanted to go home, to see the woman and child in the photograph, to live the life he'd been fighting for. He got that life, 60 more years of it. He watched his daughter grow up, have children of her own. He worked as an engineer building things instead of destroying them. He rarely spoke about the war. When pressed, he'd say only, "I did what needed doing." But sometimes late at night, he'd take out the old logbook, run his fingers over the 7 words he'd written. "If I am wrong, we all die." The ink had faded, but the weight remained. Because precision is easy when nothing depends on it. It's when lives hang in the balance, 203 men trusting you, 971 men dying because you were right, that mathematics becomes more than numbers. It becomes responsibility, legacy, the difference between returning home and disappearing into Arctic silence. The navigator died in 2003, aged 82. At his funeral, a German veteran no one recognized stood at the back. He didn't speak, just stood in silence until the service ended, then walked to the grave, placed a single white rose on the coffin, and left. Someone asked who he was. "A pilot," the navigator's daughter said quietly. "From Bardufoss." The 2 men had never stopped meeting. Every few years, a quiet drink in a quiet pub. No cameras, no interviews. Just 2 old men who understood something the rest of the world never could, that the line between enemy and brother is thinner than anyone wants to admit. That war makes monsters of geography, not men. That the real victory isn't measured in ships sunk or bombs dropped, it's measured in the ability to shake hands afterward and mean it. Today, the pencil line the navigator drew exists only in declassified archives. But its echo remains. In every precision strike that minimizes casualties. In every mission planned with care instead of brutality. In every navigator who double-checks their math because lives depend on being right. Sometimes the wildest machines weren't madness, they were foresight. And sometimes the greatest weapon isn't a bomb at all. It's a pencil, a chart, and a man willing to stake everything on the belief that precision, courage, and calculated risk can dismantle even the mightiest beasts and leave something better in their place. Not destruction, peace.